Welcome to the latest edition of Broadband Action, the CBAN podcast. I'm Curtis Dean. You know, there's a lot of concern among industry insiders and people who are concerned about the well-being of Americans and their broadband, that the reliance on low Earth orbit satellite to solve our broadband problems may be something that's not the best public policy. That the low Earth orbit technology that is being announced and already is available is amazing. It's groundbreaking, but it maybe isn't going to scale as well as everybody thinks it might, including the companies that are launching the satellites and offering the service. And it may not actually bring Americans the kind of quality broadband that they really are going to need into the future. We're going to be talking about that today with my guest, Glenn Fishbine rather. Glenn is with Breaking Point Solutions, and Glenn is and Breaking Point was part of a study that was released a little while ago that we're going to talk about today. And we'll also talk about some other information that's come to light since then about low Earth orbit and its ability to meet all of our needs. So, Glenn, thanks for coming on. Appreciate it.
Well, thank you, Curtis. It's always an interesting topic for us to deal with. Getting broadband out there is never an easy task for anybody.
It isn't. And this BEAD process has really showed just how complicated broadband for everyone is, right? Because there was a lot of the emphasis on the BEAD program as it came out of Congress and out of the previous administration was fiber first, fiber forward, if you would. That we were going to try to build as much fiber with that 42 point whatever billion as we possibly could, and we'd reserve other technologies for the locations that were most expensive and completely out of range of feasibility, and that's where technologies like low Earth orbit satellite or fixed wireless might play a role. But as the process has evolved and changes have been made and policies have been changed, we've seen the emergence of, still fiber is the leader in what's being announced for BEAD as the states get their plans finalized and through NIST approval. But low Earth orbit is playing a bigger and bigger role and getting a lot of those locations. So your study that, Glenn, you were a part of, and I'll let you describe it in more detail, really kind of dived into, what are the limitations on low Earth orbit satellite to serve these unserved areas and underserved areas with the kind of capacity that the law says they need to have, 100 download and 20 megabit upload. So talk a little bit about how did the study come about, first of all, Glenn, and how did you guys put that all together?
Well, the origin of the general concepts that we work with are based on some of the feasibility studies that we've been doing for the last half decade or so. And at the beginning, what we're looking at is fiber versus fixed wireless versus cable versus DSL. Mm-hmm. And when you're planning out a network, you're always looking at a capacity constraint. For example, when you're talking about fiber, there's only so many megabits or gigabits per fiber strand that you can run through that fiber. When you're doing fixed wireless, there's only so many connections you can make in a sector before you start going into what we call mumble mode, where mm-hmm. the end users start talking to the tower saying, I'm here, I don't have any message, and nothing gets through. And then when the low Earth orbit technology started coming about, it started turning out to be real, and in many cases, very, very effective. We would naturally want to start looking at, okay, what are those capacity limits and how well do they work over what area, over what period of time? Mm-hmm. So it was not a surprise that, like with fiber, fixed wireless, cable TV, DSL, that there are limitations. Physics demands that there are limitations to almost any type of transmission medium. You can't choose the frequency and say, mm-hmm. I'm going to do an infinite throughput. The frequency limits you as to what your capacity is going to do, or how much or how big that capacity is. So with that sort of background, knowing that there are limits out there somewhere, we decided to try to analyze the actual low Earth orbit performance based upon publicly available information, which includes things like the frequency involved, how the antenna structures are beam formed to look at a particular area. This is great technology. I mean, it's remarkable. But what it
Hmm.
boils down to is when you start looking at how the beam forming works, how connectivity is maintained, and the frequencies that are involved, you start saying automatically there are limitations. One limitation, for example, would be if there is a hill in the way, there will be no signal. If there's trees in the way, there will be no signal. Now, Starlink, for example, they have an Android and iPhone app where you basically take it outside and start looking at the horizon. And it's going to tell you how many trees to cut down or
Yeah.
where your best antenna mounting is going to be. So one of the limitation factors is if you have a lot of foliage, if you're in a forest or if you're at the bottom of a ravine, you will not have enough sky coverage to actually see a satellite. That's true not just of Starlink, but of any low Earth orbit solution. The next type of issue that we look at is, okay, so they're using a particular frequency for the transmission. They're using a certain type of beamforming technology. We don't have vendor released details on that, but we do have other public information that suggests what those are. So we took some basic assumptions as to how the beamforming worked and what the capacity would be on the beam. And we basically came up with the analysis that's shown in the paper. Now, what that basically showed was for the area covered by a single beam, if the capacity requires more than 6 stations per square mile, then you are not going to hit the 100 by 20 characteristics. Now, this has also been one of the most misinterpreted parts of the study. We have people who claim 6 households per square mile, it doesn't work. Well, that's not true. It's the entire beam area density of 6 per square mile. And the beams can be something like 60, 120 square miles or even more.
Hmm.
Uh, so those are limitations. But on the other hand, when we started looking at real world implementation projections, we started seeing cases where you would need more than one beam in order to
Hmm.
meet the threshold, or 2, or 3, or 8, or more. And now you start looking at what happens when you have multiple beams covering the same area, and you start getting potential interference between the beams, depending upon how you do your frequency matching. So you can't solve the problem necessarily just by adding more beams, because at some point the electronics can't discriminate between the interference between the beams. And therefore, again, you're going to hit another limit. So what you also have to look at is how many beamforms can be generated from a single satellite.
Hmm.
That number can be very small or can be extremely large, which allows the low Earth orbit satellites to cover a vast area. But as the densities of those areas increase, you have to start overlapping the beams again, which starts causing interference, which will again limit the total capacity that can be gotten from that, which again can drop below 100 by 20, especially in higher density areas. Some of the things that we saw in terms of the actual BEAD context was there were areas of extreme high density that nobody else bid on. They were
Hmm.
low Earth orbit bids only. And these would be areas which might have 10,000 households in them, packed in a very, very tight area. So in a scenario like that, you would expect high rates of failure in what those areas, what constitutes urban areas in those remote parts of the country. So it's not like it's a definitive, it will work only, but, or it won't work. There's a lot of caution about
Yeah.
expectations. And part of that caution could only be derived if the actual technical specifications were published by the low Earth orbit folks. There's my
Right.
introduction.
Which they are not doing because it's proprietary and it's their technology and they don't want anyone else to see it. And so we get that. We get that. Does anybody get access to that? So in other words, the NTIA is out there deciding whether or not an application should be passed through based on their criteria. But I assuming they don't get to see what's behind the curtain either.
A lot of what we were able to see is material submitted to the FCC as part of the licensing processes.
Okay.
Now, that doesn't mean that's the exact technology, but that's what they're asking the FCC to grant licenses for. So it's got to be
Right.
close to what they already
Okay.
published to the FCC.
Gotcha. Okay. So Let's talk about that because what we know today and what will develop, this will evolve over time. One of the things that hasn't evolved very fast that I want to talk a little bit about is competition. Um, it's Amazon was very active in the BEAD application round, right? They applied for a lot of locations. They were awarded a lot of locations. As Amazon's low Earth orbit product, which they've ingenuously named Leo, I'm sure they'll use a lion to represent it. As it exists today, are they able to cover much of any of the locations they've been awarded?
They do not at this time have a commercial product for sale. They're still building up their satellite constellation. They need to have more or less continuous coverage, which means a lot more satellites before they can actually offer it. I'm sure there are test locations being done,
Mhm.
but as a reliable service today, they have a lot more launches to do.
And they're behind from everything I've read. The launch cadence is not nearly what they expected it to be. Now they're of course in a way that they're beholden to others. They're developing their own rocket, right? But as they develop their rocket, they've been having to rely on others, and others have been developing new rockets like the Vulcan that can't handle the launch. They haven't been. It hasn't come together the way they wanted to. Whereby their competitor, SpaceX, and Starlink have been able to use their own rockets that are established, proven, remarkable technology, and they're launching 2 or 3 times a week. So they've been able to keep up with the cadence. Although my understanding is their ultimate goal of 60,000 plus satellites is totally reliant on their Starship being developed. And this is not a space technology show, by the way, folks. I just want you to know I'm a space geek. So I do watch all the podcasters that talk about space. So I'm very up on this. So in that regard, what are the ways that the satellite LEO satellite technologies will be able to potentially, not that we know that they are going to, but what are the ways they could potentially up their game, so to speak, to meet those standards that BEAD set? Or in addition to that, many of us agree the BEAD standards are too low. What happens in 3 to 5 years when we've got to have 200 by 200 or a gigabyte because of all the technology and all the changes that were going on? So maybe talk a little bit about um, what can they do and what are they trying to do to up their game?
All right. Well, first of all, I left my crystal ball elsewhere.
Yeah,
All right.
we have
Let's think.
someone else with a crystal ball that'll be on next week. So
All right, so let's take some extremes to sort of narrow in what's possible and what's not possible. Let's pretend you want to connect all of New York City via low Earth orbit satellite.
okay.
All right, now I'm not sure exactly how many structures are there, but you've got 8 million odd people in a very compact area. We'll pretend all the fiber and all the wireless goes away, and now you're reliant upon low Earth orbit satellites. All right, well, if you take a look at how constellation works, it's over water, over the ocean, about 2/3 of the time, sometimes more, depending upon the orbit. So you can't use all 60,000 satellites at once. You're using a
Mhm.
fraction of that, which happen to be over land. And then how many are going to be over the United States at a given time? Maybe 3%. So you cannot get to the unlimited capacity of everybody gets a gigabyte in high density areas. You can certainly do that in low density areas. If you look at the Kuiper antenna offerings that they have, I guess you call low, middle, and high performance. And the high performance is supposed to be 1 gig synchronous. So
Really?
the tech, really, but of
Will it
course,
crack the
nobody's.
synchronous, or is it just that SpaceX is choosing not to be synchronous?
I think it's that right now, Kuiper's under development, so they have an ambition of
I
achieving those goals. Right.
stretch
It
goal.
looks like fiber, smells like fiber, it's as good as fiber.
Yeah.
Um, but again, you have the capacity issues again. How big is the channel capacity for a given frequency? And if you're operating in a gigahertz range frequency, which these types of satellite technologies are, you're not going to get a 10 gigabit signal or 20 gigabit signal, and these signals have to be distributed among all the users that are currently on that system. Now, Kuiper, I think, has a slightly different approach from SpaceX. They're looking more at the business to business side rather than the retail side. They do have retail offerings in their antennas, but they also have high-end antennas that are, in principle, going to perform better than SpaceX. Now, there's two other factors that start coming into play when you start getting into those 10,000s of satellites. All right, so you've got the US-based company, SpaceX, Kuiper. You've got Chinese companies that are trying to do the same thing. You're probably going to have an EU attempt to do something similar. And now what you've got is you've got 60,000 satellites that are constantly going into orbit or deorbiting, on dumping all kinds of aluminum oxide gases in the atmosphere. And you are raising the possibility of a Kessler syndrome, whereby instead of worrying about signals, you're worrying about fragmented satellite fragments hitting more satellites, creating more fragments, and then you're done with low Earth orbit. So
Thank you for
there's a
saying
balance.
Kessler syndrome before I did. I wrote it down before we started because this has been in the back of my mind for years.
All right, so I guess a
People
definition.
don't know what it is. The Kessler syndrome is the idea that low Earth orbit especially has become really crowded, and that two satellites running into each other accidentally or on purpose could create a chain effect of chain reaction of debris in orbit hitting other satellites, and pretty soon we've lost low Earth orbit to anything use because it's too dangerous. That's the concept behind it. Nobody talks about that. Policy makers do not talk about that when they're talking about how many satellites we can put. They're just like, oh, well, you stay in your orbit and you stay in your orbit and everybody's going to be fine. But it doesn't account for the fact that things don't stay in their orbit, especially if there's an accident.
Well, SpaceX, for example, they have automatic maneuvering features in their orbit.
Yeah.
When they calculate a potential collision, they will move themselves, hopefully, out of collision paths. The ISS has been doing a first placed up there to avoid debris. I don't know how many the U.S. Was the Space Force it is now is tracking in terms of debris larger than a paint chip. But think of the orbital velocity of 17,000 miles per hour. Paint chip hits the outside of a satellite. That is not a harmless dent that's going to occur. There is significant damage that occurs at those speeds. So it's not out of line to think in terms of getting too much satellite goodwill up there and start having the issue of debris management. Now, that's not part of the BEAD program at all. And it's not a consideration that anybody had in the development of the program, but it is a potential risk of going down the path that can't be ignored, even though it has nothing to do with bandwidth or throughput.
So I've seen recently that SpaceX in particular, but others are wanting the federal government to release more spectrum for use. And I mean, that applies to the terrestrial based companies, mobile companies. Everybody needs more spectrum. Satellite would like more spectrum. Talk about the relationship between spectrum, available spectrum, and the ability to push data through it.
Well, it's very simple. It's almost a linear relationship. The higher the frequency of radio frequency that you go, the more data you can push through it. When you think about simple concept of 5G, which isn't so simple, you have some 5G that runs at 800 megahertz, and that can easily deliver 100 by 20 to a hotspot, and that's a very common cell phone solution. Then you got a different kind of 5G, which can deliver gigabit, and that means that I need a frequency somewhere north of probably 8 gigahertz. And you can go as high as 40 gigahertz. Now, the problem is that as the frequency goes up, the ability to use the frequency goes down. For example, at higher frequencies, a snowstorm or a rainstorm or fog can drop the signal. One of the things that was very amusing back in the days when I was working with cell companies is that you would have excellent signal quality coming out of a cell tower in the winter, and then the leaves would form in the spring, and your performance would drop because you couldn't get through the leaves through the forest. when we talk about using more frequencies, we're talking about, yeah, we can use frequency to get more throughput, but ultimately there's a limit as to what a frequency you can deliver. You think of it as typically, and you can get around this, but for every 8 hertz of frequency, you can get 1 bit through. Now, sometimes you can change that. There's a lot of different ways you can play that game, and you can actually do multiples of 8 if you engineer it correctly. But there's a limit as to what your detector can do, what your polarizing receiver can do. So even if I have a 1 gigahertz signal, and typically we're talking about 2 gigahertz or better in satellite scenarios, there's still a limit as to how much data you can put on that frequency. Now, the other side is if I can have 2 adjacent frequencies that don't interfere with each other, I can double my input, my throughput. And so you need as many subbands within your frequency range as you can successfully separate. And that can be a very large number, but SpaceX wanting to get more frequency, Amazon, everybody will want more frequency. But there are ultimately, as long as frequencies are regulated, there's going to be limits as to how many of those frequencies you can get your hand on, and that's going to put a limit again as to what your throughput can be.
Physics is hard to get around, isn't it?
It is. It's very annoying.
Well, I'm sure that our friends at all the different wireless companies would like to believe that all those problems will be solved through innovation, but then there's going to be I would think there's a physical wall there. There's only so much you can do. And with new codexes and new ways of squeezing more data into the same amount of spectrum. I mean, it's one of the things that I've always thought is interesting about. You mentioned it earlier. Everybody wants to say, well, we deliver fiber like speeds. Well, when you're getting compared as the standard, it's kind of a good sign. And even with light, what the original amount of data you could push through a piece of glass was a lot lower than it is now. So there's been a lot of tremendous innovation in getting more and more data through fiber. So I assume that they're maybe hoping that some of that innovation hits the wireless world too, including satellite.
Well, if they can shift frequencies, for example, into the optical spectrum instead of the radio spectrum, then it's another game changer. And there's tentative footsteps where we've done interplanetary transmissions as a test using laser. But again, now you've got a really interesting beamforming problem, like how big is your laser? How intense is it when it gets to the ground? And then
how many birds does it fry on the way? Yeah.
Right. And can it get through cloud?
Cloud cover, and there's a lot of variables there. Visible light and clouds don't go well together.
So it's not that it's totally limited, but there are different problems that haven't been thought of that have to be solved to get to the next step.
Yeah. Totally agree with that. Another issue, and again, I don't want everybody to think we're just crapping on low Earth orbit satellite, because I think we both agree, and I've been saying for years, it's amazing, and it absolutely has a use case. But it's like anything else. If you rely on it for too much, you're going to strain the capabilities. One of the capability limitations right now, I believe that both of them would have, but certainly SpaceX, since they've been operational for some time, is just Earth station upload. They've got that internet just doesn't go through space to your computer. It's got to start somewhere on Earth to get to you. And that's an Earth station that shoots up signal to the satellites. And you mentioned optical. That's something SpaceX has been working on too, is linking their satellites in orbit via light signals so that they don't have to have as many Earth stations. But that adds to their latency, that slows down performance. The fewer Earth stations they have, I would assume that impacts the performance as well.
The upside on that is that the Earth station costs have dropped dramatically. True. I remember my hometown of many places. There was a Earth station that I think the construction value was $10 million. Most of that went into the antenna. Well, that was a long time ago. Now you can probably build a quality Earth station at a good fiber access point to the general internet for under $10,000.
Oh, wow.
So that's not so much of a problem as it used to be, but you still need to have real estate and contracts and access to tier 3 fiber. Um, but those are solvable problems. That's not as
Okay,
bad as getting a satellite into orbit. That's a hard
gotcha.
problem.
Well, that's still the hard part. Uh, Again, we mentioned physics is a tough one. Gravity's pretty bad too, as far as getting around it. So,
But back to a comment you just made about how
yeah,
the technology is amazing. There's no way to understate that. I mean,
yeah,
these low Earth orbit solutions are bringing broadband to people who never had a chance of getting broadband.
absolutely.
Millions upon millions of people throughout the planet, and even in the United States. There are definitely cases where there is no better possible solution than a low Earth
Hmm.
orbit solution. The question that we pose is, when is it potentially limited?
Right.
And those are the limit cases that we focused on in that research. Not to say that, like you said, there's nothing bad about it unless you over expect
Yeah.
performance.
We have a CBAN member operator that was a tentative BEAD recipient in the Northeast, and told me that because of the way the BEAD program was structured in his state, he had to apply for all the locations in a particular polygon. And one of those locations was on the top of a mountain, and that skewed his application so high. And he's like, I wish they could just, and maybe they will in the end, let me just say to that location, let Starlink have that. I'll take the rest. My overall cost per premise passed will be much more reasonable, and I won't have to drop $70,000-$80,000 to serve that one cabin up there that's only occupied 3 months of the year. So that's the use case, it seems to me, that is an absolute slam dunk for low Earth orbit. And not only that, but if it is more limited to a limited number of people because you're serving the rest with other terrestrial technologies, then capacity won't be strained. Those people will have a much better experience than they would if we're trying to shove too much through it. So,
Correct. Again, I don't know how BEAD's going to shake out. What we're thinking about is the possibility that people won't subscribe to satellite because of the cost, or because they
yeah,
have to install it themselves, or many excuses as to why you don't do it. I think, what was it, in Maine, before BEAD went out, the state itself subsidized Starlink application, would pay for them. And I think their initial response was about a 5% take rate. So people, it's not that it didn't work, it's that people were somehow not accepting of it.
yeah,
And that meant
yeah.
that even though this is a wonderful idea, um, it it was not working as well as people hoped it would be.
Right.
I don't know what the current stats are. I think you mentioned earlier, it might be up to 7 or 8% now.
Yeah, it's somewhere in the it's still in the single digits for sure. And I know that they're working on lower cost options, and we really don't know yet what Amazon will do with their Leo product, but still, affordability is still a challenge for many people. That applies for no matter what the network is, whether it's fiber or satellite or whatever. There's still going to be a certain percentage of people that don't have the income to support $100 a month plus for their internet connectivity. So
Well,
that's going to be a barrier as
competition
well.
will bring price down
Oh
as
yeah,
long as they
yeah,
maintain
yeah,
profitability, but when and how much, we don't know yet.
yeah. Well, it's a great topic. It's a topic that a lot of us in the industry track closely. I track it for multiple reasons, and I'm also a space geek, so I'm constantly watching launches on YouTube, and my wife just rolls her eyes as I do. But fan of the technology, and not necessarily a fan of using it as a one size fits all solution. So, Glenn, I want to thank you for your visit with us here today. I want to remind everybody where the study is. I've got a URL, a shortened URL on the screen. If you're watching this on YouTube, jot that down and go access the study. If you are watching or listening to this on either without video on YouTube, or you're listening to it on your favorite podcast platform, then I will put that in the description below. And before we go, shameless plug, Glenn, I'm going to tell people, please hit like or subscribe. And we would like to continue spreading the word about the content we're producing here at CBAN, along with our members like Breaking Point Solutions. And They're been kind enough to give us some time today to talk about this topic. And I want to thank you, Glenn, for being a guest, and thank you all for joining us here today. We'll see you all here next time on Broadband Action.